We have participants streaming in, so we'll give them another moment before we get started. Okay, well, I would like to welcome our participants today for being an upstander and our conversation with Valiant Voices. Before we get started, I would like to share a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since even before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with staff throughout Minnesota, and acknowledges we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that have been inflicted upon Indigenous people globally. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women here in Minnesota and in many places around the world. So please join us now in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can join the effort to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. Also, since people are joining here from around the world at this time, if you would like to put in the chat the land that you are acknowledging, we'd appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you so much for coming to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I am Patricia Cumbie, pronouns she, her, and I'll be today's moderator. I am the communications manager for Global Rights for Women, and Global Rights for Women is an organization with the mission to end domestic and sexual violence around the world. Valiant Voices is a conversation series created by Global Rights for Women that features the human rights advocates and survivors addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are the stories of powerful leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. We are live streaming on Facebook today and welcome your comments there or in the chat on Zoom. After this conversation, we will be sending out a link with the recording. And now I am just so delighted and so honored to introduce you to our guests today. So Megan Rae has worked in the field of relationship violence since 2009, offering professional training and direct services to targeted communities of violence and those working in a variety of social work fields. Rae has had the opportunity to work independently with her own company, WEN, Education and Training, within the nonprofit sector and higher education. Rae specializes in relationship violence, sexual assault, consent, bystander intervention, eating disorders, trauma, PTSD, and gender identities. Rae provides hand-on training, fostering inclusion, sensitivity, and cultural change, challenging community accountability, and welcome so much, Megan. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much.
And Kia Whittier has been working in the sexual and domestic violence field since 2016 as the underserved population support advocate at Standpoint here in Minnesota. Whittier is responsible for developing, facilitating, and expanding programs to respond to the specific legal needs of underserved communities across the state of Minnesota, She's heavily involved in her community in South Minneapolis and believes true transformation comes when communities are united. Thank you so much, Kia, for being here. So we decided to host this particular conversation because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we wanted to, take the opportunity to talk about it much more widely with people interested in ending domestic violence. So before we get started with our questions, I'd like to share a few statistics with our listeners today. One in three women will experience some kind of gender-based violence in her lifetime. 1 in 7 women will be injured by an intimate partner, and 1 in 10 is raped by an intimate partner. And if you are a woman of color, this oppression is multiplied. For Black women, 45% will experience violence, almost half. For Indigenous women, 84% will experience violence. And I know these are really staggering statistics, but one of the things that we know at Global Rights for Women is that many of these violent incidents actually go unreported. So we think that these statistics are underreported and that violence is much more widespread. And of course, as a lot of people recognize now, the pandemic has also made gender-based violence worse, and up to 20% or more, depending on the country. So this is an incredibly relevant conversation, no matter the month, but this particular month is a great opportunity to have this conversation. So part of the impetus for doing this is, so often the public conversation around Domestic Violence Awareness Month focuses on how victims can access help through various helplines. And yeah, that's great. But I think we need to expand the conversation because we know, 1 in 3 women will experience some form of violence in her lifetime, that if it isn't happening to you, it's highly likely that there are people in our lives who are going through a crisis, whether we know it or not. So Megan, when we think about that kind of impact, as well as the need for broad social change, what are some of the things that people can do to be more than bystanders and become upstanders on this issue?
Yeah, thank you again for inviting both of us into this conversation. It's really, really important and close to the work that I'm passionate about. I think very simply, one of the first things that we can do is start to actually envision domestic violence as a community problem, right? That it's not just something that occurs between the select people that are involved, the person that's experiencing harm or the person that's causing it, but really it is a community issue. And if we think about it that way, and then we think about how are we an upstander, which the difference between a bystander and an upstander is the element of action, right? Is that we do have a call into the community. And when we envision it that way, I think we really open up the opportunity to think about how we respond to violence earlier, right? What you said, Patricia, which I think is really wonderful, is that when we talk about specifically the highlighted month, one of the things that we really focus on are resources, right? How do we support someone? And that is so, so important. And I don't want to underestimate having those services, but those services are really in a result when the harm has already happened, right? And there's so much that happens before maybe those services need to be implemented. So as a community, I think part of shifting the narrative is thinking about, where do we have these conversations, or where do the interventions happen before those services maybe need to be engaged? And being able to recognize when someone might be experiencing something that is harmful to them. And I also think the core of that is understanding and acknowledging that domestic violence and sexual assault is really, really fundamentally imbalance of power and control, right? That can happen for all the elements, whether it's ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, your political or religious views, your financial status, all of those things. When we start to think about our identity as an element of power and control and be aware of how those things can show up differently, I think that then we have an opportunity to start recognizing some of the symptoms and signs when someone might be experiencing violence at home. And just to quite briefly, one of the really simplified ways that we can maybe think about, something seems off is really when someone starts to alter their norm, right? My experience in working with people is that alteration usually goes to one extreme or the other, right? If we think about how, like, socializing for one, over socializing or isolation, even when you think about when we've experienced trauma, our sleeping patterns, our eating patterns, they alter. It's our body responding to an external element. And I would encourage folks, when you start to see those alterations, to be brave and have those conversations and really name what you're noticing, rather than, hey, is everything cool? But I'm noticing that you're not attending things or you're sleeping a lot, and really naming what you're observing, because the person that is experiencing or demonstrating those behaviors might not even know that they're showing up differently. And you might be alerting them to their own body responses to trauma.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think this is exactly why we're having these conversations, because so often it kind of turns into tropes like, well, if he's so terrible, why don't you leave? Or, things that ultimately blame people for their choices. And it seems like that is a really concrete way to, find out more from the people in your life, without having that baggage of judgment. Just, I'm noticing X is a really great entree and fabulous thing in the toolbox for being an upstander. So, one of the things that we do at Global Rights for Women is that, we are working to impact broad social change, because, the attitudes that people bring to their work are the same attitudes that impact our systems and the creation of our systems. So Kia, as someone who's an advocate, one of the things that we know is that the system treats survivor needs and concerns inconsistently, including blaming women for their choices, systemic racism, and the acceptance of certain gender norms that hold women in particular back. So, as an advocate, what do you do to change that? And then I also have kind of like a second part in that question, which is, as a member of the general public, like myself, what are things people can do to change the system too?
Ooh, Pat,
I know. Thanks
that...
for answering this big question.
Yes. Oh, yeah. It's a big question. It's a great question. And it's a tough, yet easy one to answer. And it's easy in the sense because, just straight up, the system isn't broken. It's operating exactly as it was designed to. It was designed to oppress people, to other them, to make them feel less than, yet dependent on resources provided by those in power to maintain their power and control. And I'm going to get back to that power and control piece in just a second, because I want to kind of expand on that. But it's also a tough question to answer, because how do you change a system that was designed to oppress and keep certain people and groups in power, especially a system that's been operating for centuries and is integral to the foundation of what is America, right? So as an advocate who wants to change this system, I have to do several things. And I think these things also these same approaches reign true for members of the general public. Yeah, I'm hoping this is helpful, but what I try and do
is not to get overwhelmed. I don't know about anyone listening right now, but there's so many times where I've tried laying down in my bed, going to sleep, and then all of the thoughts about the stuff that we're dealing with in our country and world just comes to my mind at that point. And then I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. And it's just very easy and realistic to get overwhelmed. I totally understand. And to feel lost and hopeless, but try to recognize that that is not good for you and it won't keep you sane in trying to push back against these systems. I have to recognize and remind myself that I'm one individual person, which does allow me to make impact where I can, which does tie into another approach, which is to use my individual power to strengthen collective power. And collective power is just, people coming together and for a cause and trying to make change. So find others whose views align with yours. That's what I try to do and make change where I can. And I try to help educate those in our field and outside of our field who are almost there, just need a little bit of guidance. And then we've strengthened that collective power. I just try to start where I can, where we can, just through conversations. That's really how a lot of these things change. And one of my favorite quotes actually is by Miriam Kaba, and she says, "Everything worthwhile is done with others." And that is just so applicable to being an upstander, to pushing back on all of the isms that exist in our city, state, country, world. And also taking an intersectional approach. The DVSB field and any field that exists really to make change has to take an intersectional approach. This system, it wants us to be tired and exhausted by providing us with limited resources where we can only focus on one specific issue, when in reality, a lot of these oppressions, they exist together. So we have to unite. And then lastly, just being intentional. So I ask myself, why am I doing this? Who is it serving? Who is it benefiting? Is it harming anyone? And with that, what am I afraid of? Am I afraid of ruffling the feathers of funders or my supervisors? And who is that benefiting, right? To just be afraid of that. We have to ruffle feathers to make change and disrupt that status quo and pushing back against, all of the, again, oppressions that we're facing. And then just self-education, that I cannot emphasize how important it is that we are taking responsibility and educating ourselves and learning about how these oppressive systems have caused the world that we're in today. Really quick here, I do just want to get back to that power and control thing, but it really is an abusive relationship that this system has with us, right? It likes to gaslight us, make it feel like it's our fault with the positions that we're in, not the systems that have led us to where we are today. And they have this like bootstraps mentality. You have to really work hard for this in order to get what you need. And that's not healthy. It uses its privilege to determine what we are and aren't deserving of. Coercion and threats to have us concede, and intimidation to make us feel powerless and like we have no voice. But we do have power, we do have a voice, and we can do that when we come together and try to push back on some of this.
Wow, Kia, thank you so much for that answer and your real openness around talking about the role of advocacy. And I think when you were talking about that sense of overwhelm, I think, yeah, it's easy to feel that. And I think the average person also feels that same sense of overwhelm, and it really paralyzes people from taking action. So I think that your emphasis on working together and supporting those people and organizations that are doing the work of, addressing these systemic issues is really powerful, and that you do have a voice. So thank you very much for sharing that. So I have another question for you. So often in the conversation about gender-based violence, women of color are pushed to the side, uh, silenced, completely ignored. And we see this over and over again. And especially in the current high profile case in the media right now with Gabby Petito, where in so many cases we're offered a narrative of the perfect victim, which is someone who's, young, weak, or vulnerable, conventionally beautiful, white, someone who, deserves the extensive media coverage. So talk about why this narrative is so harmful.
You're just coming at me with the big questions. Yeah, it's great. So why is this narrative so harmful? Well, I didn't coin this term, but this is just a case of missing white woman syndrome. And this term was first coined by a news anchor and journalist, Gwen Ifill, in 2004. And the term refers to the phenomenon by news media outlets to routinely ignore missing BIPOC folks in favor of covering young, attractive, white middle-class cisgendered women who disappear. So just straight up, it's this missing white woman syndrome. And that does contribute to folks not wanting to ever talk about the issues that they've experienced, the violence that they've experienced, because they don't see themselves in fitting that mold necessarily. And that completely impacts them just wanting to share and talk about what's happened. But to get back to folks missing, in Wyoming, I don't know if folks listening now know this, but when I learned about it, I was just a lot of feelings, a lot of frustration. But in Wyoming, where Gabby Petito's body was found, 710 Indigenous people were reported missing between 2011 and 2020. 710 people. Yet all of these efforts were put on finding this one person. And in no way, shape, or form am I trying to minimize the harm that was caused on Gabby. I do not think it's okay, and I empathize with her family so much. But why was it 710 people that their families and tribal members had done, quote unquote, all the right things and reporting this to the authorities, yet just nothing was done? And this norm has to change. Our standards must change. Media and those with social and institutional power, they're to blame 100% for this, because BIPOC communities have been reaching out, have been asking for attention to their loved ones' cases, but no one listens. And then it just has me wonder, well, if white folks and folks with institutional power were to start crying out for support and solidarity with BIPOC folks, would something change? Most likely. And it just paints this picture that BIPOC folks are less than and not deserving of attention. And when attention is given on a BIPOC person's case, they're portrayed completely differently. With Indigenous people, they're portrayed as addicts or criminals or sex workers, therefore somehow less deserving of attention. Black folks are portrayed as they'll share, if they had any sort of criminal background, they'll share those facts. Why is that impacting the attention that their case deserves. When white people are portrayed as respected family and community members. And I know we're talking about domestic and sexual violence here, but I found the statistic that I thought was, again, just really frustrating, that I wanted to share really quickly. And so a 2015 study found that though Black children accounted for about 35% of missing children cases in the FBI database, they amounted to only 7% of media references. So that's a big, children, right, aren't receiving attention, children even. And so with that though, there's a misclassification that can happen where BIPOC folks are considered runaways, not necessarily missing, which does impact the resources that are then given to their case. And because I guess I just want to end on this, because they receive less, if any, media attention, they're more at risk of being kidnapped or murdered, because the people or the perpetrators know that no one will look for them. And with that, just representation is critical here. Just having media attention can change everything in a case, everything. And so we have to put some pressure on our media and talk about this with each other, because the perfect victim narrative is benefiting no one and is harming so many people.
Yeah, and silencing so many people. And, you know, it's so important as an upstander to hold the media to account when we see stories like this where the victim is a neat little box. And, you know, it's so important in this work that we work in partnership with survivors and hear their voices and their stories. And there's a local writer here, Carolyn Holbrook, who often says, "We are not a single story." And I think that that's so important to recognize as an upstander. So Megan, I have a question for you. When thinking about this, Domestic Violence Awareness Month again, what does safety for women look like for survivors? And what is the role of society and systems in ensuring that?
I actually think that's kind of a trick question. And the reason why I say that, especially after listening to the conversation that was shared today, is that it is so complex. Just to kind of bounce off of what Kia was stating, the reason why the media is continuing to highlight only these cases is because it feeds into the elements that the system is working, because the system works for those perfect victims, right? So this is all interlacing into a bigger problem. And why I say I think that's a trick question is that we also, as much as we have the idea of like, this is the perfect victim and this is the way that you find safety and this is the method, the linear path that you have to make. And then going back, because I love that, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, because I hate it, right? Like then when you go through that process, now it's time to move forward and get on, and there's this time frame that doesn't exist. And I think what we really need to challenge is that safety is so individual for that person, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can't
Absolutely.
tell you how many times in working with DV, like what has happened is that someone has tried to use a safety measure that they were told was going to promote safety. And what actually happened is they got launched into a system that was super harmful and not what they wanted at all. I don't think people realize that when you call 911, that then your ownership of what you want to see happen at that moment is not up to you anymore. And the amounts of times that I've heard women say, I just wanted the harm to stop, is uncountable.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about safety, we really need to stretch ourselves and trust that the person that has experienced the harm is going to know what safety looks like for them best. And I can't emphasize that enough, because when you are in a relationship, particularly with domestic violence, that you potentially have lost an uncountable amount of worth and control. That moment where someone says, I believe that you know what you need best, could be the next step for that person to really re-engage that they can navigate themselves. And safety doesn't necessarily look like the system, and safety is specific to cultures. And I think we forget that sometimes safety is repairing an abusive relationship for someone that may want to stay. And we can't negate that option. It can be really confusing, not only for society, but for a victim survivor experiencing harm, to hold both, I don't want this to happen, but I still am in love with this person and I'm not ready, or maybe my decision isn't to end this relationship. So safety for that individual might be reframing the narrative on who we're having conversations about too. It's another thing I want to add when we talk about safety. We're consistently are focusing on the victim, survivor, the person experiencing harm. That's where all our efforts are. That's where we want to have the conversations. And when we zoom out, I want to encourage us also to put accountability where accountability is due, right? How are we encouraging safety with the person that actually has the power to stop the harm? Because it doesn't matter what we put into place, the only person that really gets to make that decision is the person that is making that action, right? And we know that people that cause harm most of the time have experienced it, right? And it's this cycle. It's the cycle that there is opportunity to have an earlier intervention. And we do have those programs. And we are thinking differently about gender-based violence and what restorative justice looks like. And I want to also honor that restorative justice is not just something that the white movement decided is new and put a new label on. This is something that communities have been really engaging with safety for a very long time. So when I work with individuals that come to me and they have safety concerns, as an advocate, I feel that my job is to explain both the benefits and the harms for all the options, right? And this is what it actually looks like. And I trust you to decide what that looks like for you. And my role is to help mitigate the additional trauma of having to navigate that alone. And what I would say for community members, that maybe aren't as attached, or maybe don't consider themselves an advocate, is to really, it's something I have always discussed since I started this work, and I call it the magic of Google Grace. And what I mean by that is if you have a loved one that needs resources, sometimes to sit down and look up shelter information, therapy, food shelf, is a whole additional experience where you are internally now recognizing that you are unsafe or that you need help, and that can be crippling. So for the loved ones that don't know how to support a family member that they know, get together the resources for them so that all they have to do is say yes. And all you have to do is say, I found some information for you. Would that be something that you would want to talk about or listen to or look through? And then give them the power to decline. But what you've done is you've bridged this moment of, now I have to figure out what my next steps are, that can be equally as isolating and terrifying.
Thank you so much for that elegant answer. And I didn't put it out there as a trick question, but I love your response.
I tease.
In terms of, like the whole, like, as we were talking about at the beginning, here's your hotline, go to it. When clearly all of the issues involved in gender-based violence are very complex and individual, and as upstanders, we need to educate ourselves and be prepared to understand that interfacing with the system has its challenges, and part of what we do is use our voice to change that. So thank you for answering all of these really incredible questions that I've lobbed at you. Now, I want to check in with Sophia and see if we have any questions in the chat, or if anyone has anything they would like to add.
As of now, not many questions have come up. So if there's anything still on your mind, feel free to ask. But yes, if anybody has any questions, for the attendees, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also direct message me and so on.
Okay, well, fantastic. Well, one of the things that you mentioned, Megan, in answering the last question is talking about accountability for those who are abusing. And one of the things that Global Rights for Women is doing is we have a program called Pathways to Family Peace, where we work on transformational behavior change for men. And clearly, we need men to be a part of this movement. And when we think about being an upstander as a man, either one of you, if you want to take on this question, what can men do specifically?
Well, we still live in a world of toxic masculinity. If you identify, with a more masculine gender, you are entrenched in that. And as much as whether you're a man, woman, gender nonconforming, anywhere in between, we are all still entrenched in that culture when it comes to gender roles. And I would encourage not only those that maybe don't identify as causing harm to be a part of the conversation, to call in when they see it, to listen, to do all the educating as a body of privilege in this movement, but also to encourage dialogue between the folks that have caused harm, right? And have those conversations and reframe how we are talking about things that we see. It can be as simple as who are you highlighting in that sentence? Like, I noticed that you did this, right? And this was the impact. And having that call in and just naming facts like that. I watched this wonderful video and it escapes me, so I can't quote it, but I'm gonna mention it 'cause it's not mine, about just what pronouns are we highlighting. Instead of saying, I'm just gonna use the more common names, but, instead of saying, Cindy went to a party and Cindy had too much to drink and Cindy was assaulted, why aren't we just changing the conversation to say, well, Jamie went to a party and Jamie, had an interaction that was not consensual. So when we think about accountability, I think it's just the fact that we've hardwired how we talk about this stuff and being curious about how do we unravel that, and being brave to be able to go through rupture and repair, to be able to have those hard conversations with our peers in our community and trust that when someone is calling you out for potentially seeing something that is harmful, that is actually a gift, right? Because they believe that you not only can move through that moment, but they want to invest in you. And I would also encourage, when we think about accountability, is this has been kind of a catchphrase recently that I think we also need to think about different. And it's impact versus intention, right? Intention versus impact. And I think when we harm someone and we're called out on it, whether it be by an upstander or by the person that has experienced it, our immediate reaction is to self-soothe and justify, right? And say, well, I didn't mean to say that thing, or I didn't mean to make you feel that way, or I didn't, and we center ourselves in that moment rather than centering the person that is actually calling us in to think differently and allowing them to hold the importance of voice in that space. So I think a simple, I went on a tangent, but I'm going to go with it because I like it. But I think a simple thing we can do is, when we are in a culture where we want to promote taking action and being an upstander, is that when you are called out, to take that as a gift of someone that wants to invest in growth with you to strengthen your relationship, and hold that uncomfortability of wanting to justify unless that's important to the person having that conversation. And instead of saying that wasn't my intention, just change it to say, thank you for letting me know what the impact was of my action or my words.
Great. So it looks like in the chat we have a question. I'd love to hear about the differences between bystanders and upstanders. Kia, you look like you're poised. No.
I think simply bystander is someone that is standing alongside something that they are witnessing, right? And historically, maybe a decade ago, bystander intervention would be the concept that once you have witnessed it, that you're doing some sort of intervening. More recently, we've separated bystander from upstander in the fact that not only are you in the space that you're witnessing something, but you're not standing by, you're standing up. So there is an element of exact some sort of action. And when I do bystander intervention training, I still lean on a little bit of the historical about to distract, delegate, or be direct. So distract if you're actually witnessing some sort of violent, like you can be an upstander by going in, changing the conversation, and then checking in with the parties later on. Or direct, where you go in and just name, like this interaction is like not, what's going on? How's everybody doing? I'm still that weird person at the bar that will walk up to people that I see weird things happening and just being like, hey, are you cool? Just checking in because it looks a little heated. And you would be surprised when you actually put your voice in that space, how dismantling it is for both parties. And the fact that now that they've been aware that folks are noticing something that is causing alarm, at the very least, can hopefully create some conversation.
I want to jump in and answer that too. And I think a way of thinking about the difference between a bystander and upstander is thinking about the difference between an ally and an accomplice, right? And an ally, someone who advocates for groups or individuals, but might not come from the same place of privilege as the ally. An accomplice, it encompasses allyship, but it goes beyond that advocacy. An accomplice is using their privilege to challenge existing conditions at like the risk of their own comfort and well-being. I mean, of course, don't want to like sacrifice safety, but thinking about, I think for protests are a great example, and like the uprising that happened last year. Who is standing in the front lines? And if, you know, recognizing or seeing that a police officer is getting ready to cause harm to a Black person, a white body person could be an accomplice in that sense and stand right in front of them, just as an example. But so I encourage folks who are listening to look into the differences between an ally and an accomplice more, do some of that self-education that's critical in these spaces. But I think that offers another framework of thinking about what the differences between a bystander and an upstander.
I want to jump in here too. There's a great follow-up question in the chat relating to the question we had asked before about men's role in addressing gender-based violence, and about how, as much as we have, you know, need to support victims and survivors, that on some level abusers need that same level of support. But in the chat, they talk about how this kind of might feel disloyal to the, you know, communities of survivors. So can either of you want to take that on?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's something that we're navigating with right now and really having to acknowledge as a within the domestic violence, sexual violence movement. And I'll say just for me personally, that we can focus as much as we want on victims and survivors, and we'll continue to focus on that, and we'll continue to focus on that, and continue to. But at what point are we going to have to recognize and realize that people who cause harm have been harmed themselves, like Megan had said earlier, and they deserve support too. We're not disregarding women who have been harmed. We're just offering support to try and end a cycle of violence, a generation of violence, by connecting with, and again, offering resources and support to those who have caused harm. Because if we want violence to stop and end, everyone that's impacted, whether they've caused harm or are being harmed, needs that support. And so, yes, to answer your question though, you would still be an upstander in that way because you're engaging in a level of prevention, and that makes you an upstander, in my mind at least.
Yeah, and I know we're getting close to the time, but I think that that's a wonderful viewpoint. And I would just like to add that I don't think it is taking services from one community and replacing them with another. And I think that's a good distinction. It is expanding who we are centering in that conversation and who we are also including in it, to say, we're not going to put all of the onus in healing or repair or growth on the person that has experienced harm, because you have your work to do too, right? Because you were a part of this. So it's not a replacement of services. And I think we do have to keep those very separate, right? Like, who offers the services to what community? I know for myself, I work with one population, but I love to know who's working with the other one. And I think it's about partnering, but keeping it separate and keeping the focus and the goal very clear, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's important to respect the human rights of everyone involved. And, you know, that is definitely a guiding principle for global rights for women. And we have definitely come to our time. And oh my gosh, this was such an amazing conversation, and definitely one that I think we need to continue. So thank you, Megan and Kia, for being here. And I would also like to thank the people who have been our participants today and asking such great questions. I'd like to thank my colleague, Sophia Morissette, for ensuring this conversation went smoothly on the tech side. And we've included links in the chat and in our email to you. If you would like to support Global Rights for Women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe, centering survivor voices as the means to achieving systemic change. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And we'll see you at the next Valiant Voices on December 2nd. Thank you.
Thank you.